It said you are no longer connected to the internet. Connected to the internet.
It's the dark web. Like that's a place or something.
My Tor browser says it's a place.
I don't think they call it the dark web on your Tor browser.
It's big block letters, so the dark web.
.com.
Am I not in the right spot?
Yeah, I think you might be in a different spot.
I'm going to the Salk Road? This is right?
The Tor Johnson network.
Got a Rip Torn browser.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Are they in the proper approach pattern for today?
Negative.
Hold weapons! Now! Charge the lightning field.
Welcome back to Dispatch Ajax. I'm Skip.
I am Jake.
That's true. The last time I checked, at least.
It's the last true thing you're going to hear in this episode.
2 things will be a lie and 1 will be the truth. You figure out what it is. Some of those are our names. Damn it. We blew it already.
Well, that sounds like my sex life.
So anyway,
Let's cut that out. Cut it out.
Well, we were just talking about Hellraiser, not David Coulier, but Hellraiser. So that makes more sense.
Ooh, there's a new Hellraiser sequel.
David Coulier
as a Cenobite.
Well, what else is he doing?
Get on it.
I could totally see David Coulier using like the last of his Full House money, pushing that sweaty wad toward that dude in Morocco or whatever. With the box. So, today I thought we would do stuff around the Netflix docu-series, the Manhattan UFO.
The Manhattan Alien Abduction.
There you go, Manhattan Alien Abduction.
I had read about that case years and years ago. Her name is also one that always stuck in my head. So.
Her real name or her alias in the book? Because that's a different weird name.
What, Napolitano?
That's her real name.
Yeah, that's the name that I always knew her as. When they had it in the show, I was like, why are they doing a different name?
Well, because in the book, she had a different name.
One of the many questions you might have at the end of the series.
Yeah, it's not exactly the most in-depth thing in the world. They do some interesting things, but we'll get into that. The approach that I wanted to take today was not so much, and I will talk, I don't want to say at length, but I will discuss the Manhattan UFO incident. But I thought it would be a more interesting angle, something that most people don't do, if we actually just dove more deeply into Budd Hopkins himself.
Huh, okay.
The researcher who made this incident famous, because he's responsible not just for making this a public story, but many other UFO abduction stories, to the extent where he's sort of an unsung founder of the UFO abductee phenomenon in mainstream culture. So, legend goes that a young Budd Hopkins, which is Bud with 2 Ds, by the way, which just doubles down on the fact that your kid's name is Bud, and that's not a nickname.
Bud Double D.
It's one of the worst Piranha sequels I've ever heard. Maybe that's a nickname for something, but if you use 2 Ds, his name is Bud.
The other D's for emphasis.
So a young Budd Hopkins supposedly was left traumatized by Orson Welles' 1938 CBS radio adaptation of The War of the Worlds. However, and this is something we should talk about also tangentially later, as time went on, it settled in that the reality of the widespread hysteria and panic over the broadcast itself was severely exaggerated. It rippled throughout society, really to this day. A lot of FCC standards that are used in broadcast media come from reactions to that broadcast. Like when you come back for station IDs so often, it's because of the War of the Worlds broadcast, because a lot of people's complaints were that they missed the opening warning that this was a drama, that this was a fictional thing. And there were many factors to go into that, which is why it deserves its own episode. But a lot of the hysteria behind that was completely exaggerated. Still, it likely did plant seeds in the young Hopkins, just not in the way that it may have been portrayed. Because he claimed that he was emotionally scarred and traumatized, though, honestly, it didn't even have a very big audience. Not that many people heard it, and not that many people were actually upset. It was reporting of the panic that caused more panic and the general idea that this was a huge issue. It did cause some problems, but they weren't as bad as people thought. In fact, future Tonight Show host Jack Paar had announcing duties that night for Cleveland CBS affiliate WJAR. As listeners called the studio, he attempted to calm them on the phone and on air by saying, quote, "The world is not coming to an end. Trust me. When have I ever lied to you?" But then outspoken listeners started to accuse Paar of, quote, "covering up the truth."
Great. It's always been like this.
Yeah, does this sound familiar or what? This will come up again later. So Hopkins was born June 15th, 1931 in Wheeling, West Virginia. He graduated from Oberlin College in 1953 and moved to New York, where he began a successful career as a studio artist. It's very similar to the guy that we talked about in Office Horror.
Oh, yeah.
Mostly known for that, but then overtaken by his later work. His paintings, to this day, hang in many high-profile museums, and he became a frequent contributor to art magazines and did art lectures, was guest lecturer and or guest professors at art colleges throughout the years. His interest in UFOs and alien visitations was really sparked in 1964 when he and two other guys reported experiencing a daylight sighting of a dark, disc-shaped or elliptical object in Truro, Massachusetts. When he reported the incident to nearby Otis Air National Guard Base, he was essentially laughed out of the building. So, naturally, he suspected a possible government cover-up. "I know what I saw!" This is from an interview with PBS's Nova. Quote, "I had a daytime UFO sighting on Cape Cod. It lasted about 3 minutes. The object seemed to be able to hover, and then it zoomed at great speeds straight into the wind. We had thought perhaps it was some kind of balloon or something, but it clearly wasn't. And when you see something like that, and the three of us are jumping out of the car finally to watch it disappear, you realize that there's some factor in the world you hadn't previously been aware of, and that it could be an extraordinary, important factor." So Hopkins then put his nose to the grindstone and began reading about UFOs, collecting stories of people who claim to have been experiencers of contact with alien beings. And so in 1975, Hopkins was approached by a man named George Orbarsky, that's an unfortunate name, who, supposedly, witnessed alien figures step out of a spacecraft and take soil samples at North Hudson Park in North Bergen, New Jersey. I don't know why I said it that way. That was the end of the sentence. North Bergen, New Jersey. Hopkins, a man named Ted Blocher, who was the director of the New York State's Mutual UFO Network chapter, or MUFON for people who don't know, and Jerry Stoher, who's also part of MUFON, investigated the incident, interviewing the witnesses and taking soil samples of their own.
I like to think that they had a soil sample off with the aliens later.
Ha! Take that!
93 parts nitrogen, all right?
Ha!
What you got?
Well, what's going on here? And they don't fucking know.
Oh, red clay. Yeah. Oh, we don't care about that.
Come down, take more. So after Hopkins' account of the Oberski case appeared in a writing he did in the Village Voice in 1976, he began receiving regular letters from UFO witnesses, including a few cases of missing time, which is a big thing in the UFO abductee,
Lore.
oeuvre. Yeah, sure. Which he found credible because he felt like he couldn't explain where that time went otherwise. Which might be shaky. It's a little hard to say, especially since these are just letters. So Hopkins, using data from these investigations under Blocher and a psychologist named Aphrodite Claymore.
That's a name.
That sounds like a Star Trek original series character.
You know they dress like a Greek goddess.
Right. Or it's a blaxploitation character. Expanded this idea in his 1981 book, Missing Time, a documented study of UFO abduction. Now, based greatly on abductee letters, Hopkins sort of amateurishly diagnosed the emotional responses of the abductees based on their experiences which included feelings of fear, awe of alien technology, anger, helplessness, and a form of Stockholm syndrome, where they felt affectionate or beholden to the aliens that had abducted them. Because of these responses being typical, he found them to be credible, which is also relatively problematic. He believed that aliens were, quote, callous, indifferent, amoral race bent solely upon gratifying its own scientific needs at whatever cost to us. We're already getting to a lot of leaps in logic here, unfortunately. But, I mean, he did work with a lot of clinical scientists, and these are just summations of his work. These aren't the nuts and bolts of the whole thing. So we'll hold off on judgment for now.
But he won't.
But he definitely won't. At the end of Missing Time, Hopkins included this. Quote, as an afterword, I asked anyone who felt that he or she might have had an experience similar to those dealt with in Missing Time to write me at my publisher's address. Among the hundreds of letters that arrived in response from places as divergent as Australia and Norway, Lebanon, and Canada was Kathy's. And this is a woman named Kathy Davis. He found her testimony an intriguing account. Quote, subsequently, she told me that she had written an earlier note that then she tore up, assuming that I would not probably be interested. Her second letter, however, the one she actually mailed, triggered an investigation the extent of which she clearly could not have foreseen. It has involved the skills, chemists, radiologists, medical practitioners, psychologists, and other specialists. I have made 4 trips to Indianapolis. I'm assuming that's around where she is, instead of just randomly going to Indianapolis, to interview various principals, and Kathy has come to New York 3 times. In-depth psychological tests and interviews have been employed, as has, quote, lie detection in the form of voice stress analysis administered by a professional in the field. Ultimately, and this is what would become known as the Copley Woods affair, has yielded more new information, unsettling information, it must be said, about the nature and purpose of the UFO phenomenon than any case yet investigated. This is a very large claim to make, but I believe the evidence fully justifies. So he's all on board, ignoring most of the letters he got. A lot of them, he was just like, this is bullshit, this is bullshit, this is bullshit. But with certain ones, he really believed he had an opportunity to either prove or disprove the scenario. This is a little long, but this is from the actual letter that Kathy Davis sent. Quote, around the first week of July 1983, about 8 to 9 p.m., I was preparing to go out and sew a little neighbor's home. Sew a little at a neighbor's home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that didn't make sense either. I don't know. I just make houses for the little people.
I don't know why I'm talking like this. I live in Indianapolis.
Darby O'Gill and the little people. And while I was standing at the kitchen window, I noticed a light in the pool house and the door was open. I remember shuttering it earlier, so I knew it shouldn't be open, let alone have the light on. So I mentioned it to Mom. She looked and wondered what was up, but neither of us were all that alarmed. When I got ready to leave, I decided to drive round the turnaround. This is a quote. This isn't my bad grammar. To make sure no one was out there, as Mom would be alone with the kids, in parentheses, my sons Rob 4 and Tammy 3. When I did, the light was off and the door was shut and the garage door was open, which was always kept shut. When I got to Dee Ann's house, 1 street over, I called Mom and told her what I saw and asked if she would like me to come home and check it out. And she sounded rather nervous, not like my mom at all. She said she'd seen a big light by the pool house and it moved up to the bird feeder and it grew to about 2 feet in diameter. But she didn't see any beam. It was just like a spotlight on the bird feeder, lighting it up, but nothing else around it. When I got there, it was gone. And I looked around the property with my dad's 22. I'm chicken! Exclamation mark. I did finally find my dog Penny hiding under a car out back. Usually she carries on something fierce when anyone she doesn't know is on our property. It's not like her to hide and have to be coaxed out from anywhere, especially by me. She's usually all over me. I didn't see anything. So when I went back to sew, and later that night, Dee and I and her daughter came back about midnight and went swimming. It's really hard to read this way. Right after that, our yard was burned by what we don't know. Nothing will grow there now, no matter how much water we give it. Wild animals won't go onto it. At first, Penny would walk halfway around the yard to avoid walking on it. She'd sniff and run the other way. Birds will no longer go near the bird feeder either, and we have always had tons of birds every day, especially red birds. I'm guessing she means cardinals. Well, that's the story of our backyard mystery. It's still here for anyone who wants to see it, more or less unchanged." End quote. So, this and subsequent investigations led to Hopkins' second novel, Intruders, The Incredible Visitations at Copley Woods, in 1987, which did top the New York Times bestseller list the same year as Whitley Strieber's Communion. Fascinating. Later, in 1992, a made-for-television film, Intruders, was made, featuring fictionalized characters based on the works of Hopkins and psychiatrist John E. Mack, and, like Hopkins' book, portrayed certain abduction scenarios. But back to 1989. Hopkins, in 1989, organized the Intruders Foundation as a non-profit with 4 stated goals: to provide sympathetic help, understanding, and personal investigation for those reporting UFO abduction experiences; to carry out systematic research into abduction phenomenon through careful study of its patterns and resulting physical and psychological evidence; to mount an extensive program of public education about the phenomenon; and to develop a cadre of trained professionals in various fields to carry out all these projects. And this comes from the archived Intruders Foundation website. It was essentially an abductees support group and resource center, which is, I don't know, that's an interesting thing.
No,
that's
good. I mean, these people seemingly need help.
Yeah.
With what they think they've experienced or have experienced, either way.
Yeah. I mean, they experienced something, and if this is that, then great. Go somewhere where they believe you, or at least don't shun you or shame you or call you crazy. They actually just believe you. That's good. One beneficiary of the foundation was an alleged abductee named Linda Napolitano. She was a New York City housewife who claimed that in the early morning hours of November 30th, 1989, 3 extraterrestrial beings kidnapped her from her 12th floor downtown apartment, beamed her through the sky to their spaceship, and then performed experiments on her before returning her to her bedroom. That sounds crazy, but it's one of the few abduction scenarios that has outside corroboration from multiple witnesses. Unfortunately, that gives it credibility and then also discredits it at the same time, as we'll get into. You know what? It's a crazy, complicated, and very unfortunate scenario. In February of 1991, Hopkins received a letter documenting this event, but not from Napolitano. Quote, "Dear Mr. Hopkins, my partner and I are police officers. We have been in a serious dilemma because of our strict profession and our lack of knowledge on this subject. We didn't know what to do or who to turn to and hadn't done so until recently. We researched the bookstores over and came up with you. There was an address in your book, Intruders, but it was through your publishers. In turn, we let our fingers do the walking through the white pages." This is like a fucking ad. But he's old like us, remembers those. "Much to our surprise, there you were. We are hoping that you are the correct Budd Hopkins, so here it goes. One early morning, about 3 to 3:30 a.m. in late November 1989, we sat in our patrol car underneath the elevated FDR Drive on South Street and Catherine Slip, observing the surroundings ahead. Sitting on the passenger side of our vehicle, I reached into my shirt pocket for a stick of gum. As I opened it, I looked down at the silver wrapping that was in my hand, saw it reflecting a firelight type of reddish glow. I looked up through the windshield to see where it was coming from, and there it was. A strange oval hovering above the top of an apartment building 2 to 3 blocks up from where we were sitting. That might be the coming of Gozer. It's really hard to say.
You mean the Gozerian?
The very same. We didn't know where it came from. Its lights turned from a bright reddish orange to a very bright whitish blue coming out from the bottom of it. It moved out away from the building and lowered itself to an apartment window just below. I yelled for my partner who was sitting beside me behind the wheel of the patrol car, and he was just as excited as I was. Answer yourself, boys.
I looked at his pants and boy, he was raging for this light in the sky.
He was so excited. I had to be sure of what it was I was seeing, so I went to the glove compartment to get a pair of binoculars and not condoms at all.
I promise you, they're not condoms. Anyway, this is the story.
We grabbed hold of each other. Uh-oh. story.
This is deep cover mission, I think.
This is the way it's written.
Hey, partner, you want to get staked out?
Except they can't be, and we'll explore why later. And it's really crazy. I had to be sure of what it was I was seeing, so I went to the glove compartment to get a pair of binoculars. We grabbed hold of each other, and we're going to get out of the car. But what could we do for that poor little girl or woman wearing a full white nightgown? She was floating in midair in a bright beam of whitish blue light, looking like an angel. She was then brought up into the bottom of the very large oval, about 3/4 the size of the building across. Now, they did not know her. They had no knowledge of who she was. They witnessed this on their own, which is an extremely interesting point. However, not a smoking gun, an interesting idea. This didn't come from her at first.
Yeah.
This is where we get into some problems here. To continue with the letter. This poor person was escorted out of her window. I don't know if she was willing or not. I don't think so, because it seemed as though she was being escorted up into this thing by 3 ugly but smaller human-like creatures. Okay, let's pause there. Was there a window? Was it like a Zeppelin where they have like a thing and you look into the windows?
I mean, there have been many cases throughout the decades of describing windows on crafts. But the way that it was described before, she was just going up into this oval, into this craft.
Before, by them.
Yeah, but I don't understand.
So
where do we get these? How do they see these creatures?
Right. Where were they? What were they doing? Were they physically carrying her? Because they don't seem to indicate that at any other point.
And they can make out 3 creatures from how many?
12 stories up?
Yeah, at least.
And you can tell they're not human? I mean, maybe if they're weirdly shaped, I guess. But, I mean, like, that's such a weird non sequitur in the middle of this that doesn't seem to gel. But that's not the biggest problem with this, and we'll get to the bigger problems. They were supposedly 3 ugly but smaller human-like creatures, 1 above her and 2 below. They seem to be in charge. On top of our fear of getting involved, we were also carrying a load of guilt because we didn't help her and we didn't know what was going to become of her. After she was escorted up and in, the oval turned reddish orange again and whisked away, coming in our direction, above us. It must have flown over the FDR drive while we were sitting beneath it. Then it plunged into the river behind us, not far from Pier 17, behind the Brooklyn Bridge. Someone else had to see what happened that morning. I know what we saw.
Don't tell me I didn't see it.
I saw it happen. Don't tell me it didn't happen. I saw it happen. And we'll never forget it. Mr. Hopkins, the oval never came up from under the river. It's possible that it could have after we drove away about 4 to 5 minutes later. We could have stayed longer. We couldn't ignore our radio call any longer. The guilt is brutal, more so than the fear we felt when we witnessed this terrible encounter. The guilt has lingered into today, and we find it difficult living with ourselves. My partner and I have been debating for 14 or 15 months if we should seek her out. We know the building, and we know which window she came out of. Perhaps she was just a figment of our imagination. If she isn't, is she alive and well? We don't know, or we have to know. We're feeling much better now that we've had the chance to tell someone else than ourselves. We wish to stay anonymous for the time being on account of our profession. If we should decide to seek this person out, and she may very well value her privacy, as we do, and we respect that, we'll contact you again with further information if we do find her, and I hope we do. Now, I know that's long, but there's a reason I included all of that. The sign-off is, many thanks, police officers Dan and Richard. Now, if you have watched the Netflix documentary series on this case, Napolitano likened these officers to essentially the Men in Black. They were mysterious, they were secretive, they were accusatory, using vague, possibly fake names.
But they also were distinctly human.
They were human, sure, but I mean, the way that she implied their presence, she thought they were like CIA or like FBI or something.
Right. When they finally meet her.
They finally meet her.
Ideally, you guys have all watched the series before you're listening to this, so we can get into spoiler-esque territory for a case that's, I don't know, 40 years old.
And we're almost there. And I'm sure a lot of the way they presented themselves would have come across that way. Let's say they're police officers and they're trying to figure out what's going on. They're not going to tip their hand right off the bat, right? They want to know if she's crazy, if she staged something, if she did something weird, theoretically. right? So I could see why you would think, oh, they're kind of aloof and weird and standoffish. And she was very combative with them, by her own admission. It is funny in that series where she's just like, I'm an Italian woman from New York. Fuck you for accusing me of shit. I get that.
But she also seemed to be afraid of them as well.
She was 100% afraid of them. But it was those were the same cops that did reach out to Hopkins. They seemed, at that point, to be pretty upfront about their part. Except, in that letter, this is me putting pieces together here, they did imply that they were working in their capacity as police officers, right?
Yes.
In communication with Hopkins, they then claimed they were operating as bodyguards who were with their client at the time but refused to name him.
I believe that's not in that letter, but in subsequent letters, I believe that comes out.
Right. But those are contradictory letters.
Oh, very much so. And they implied that they are police officers, but
they state they're police officers in their patrol car.
But the men who are later identified by Napolitano are not police.
Right. So already this account that led to this investigation is super suspect. Red flags all over the place here. Because they stated they were police officers and implied they were working in their capacity as police officers. But then as more communication went along, they admitted that they were security detail / bodyguards for a foreign dignitary, then UN Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar.
That comes out later, because remember he signs the...
Why did they pretend like they were on patrol as cops?
To play devil's advocate, they are writing to a UFO investigator in a time where it was certainly not as well as accepted or prevalent in pop culture. They could have feared for their jobs if it had gotten out who and what they were doing.
Their credibility takes a big hit when they're omitting huge or just straight up obfuscating huge details that they're asking him to investigate this. And if they're not going to tell the truth about even their basic situation, they don't have to reveal their actual identities, but they've already set themselves up to be questioned. Let's just say, at best, they didn't help their case.
Well, I think there's a lot of issues at play.
There's a lot of issues we'll get to. Don't worry. Yeah, but that's why Hopkins got involved. Was this, that he thought a credible account from credible people.
I will say, again, one of the reasons it had teeth within the community and the larger community looking at this is that it wasn't just them. There were supposedly, 20 to 22 other witnesses?
There were supposedly 23 witnesses,
right.
Yes.
And I'm counting the cop bodyguard people as 1 to 2 people, so...
Yeah, of course, their foreign dignitary supposedly also witnessed the event.
Right. Having 1 or 2 other witnesses, that's one thing, but having 20, that has a little more staying power.
I agree completely. That part is fascinating, and I think a key element in this mystery. However, he got involved because what he assumed was an earnest statement from 2 police officers working in their capacity, and they weren't. That wasn't true. And that lines up more closely with Napolitano's assertions that they were really vague about being law enforcement and about how vague they were with their identities when they finally confronted her, which we're about to get to. According to Napolitano, around 3 a.m., she was sleeping next to her husband when she suddenly jolted awake. She claimed that she felt that something wasn't right. Something was in the room with her. And anybody who's experienced sleep paralysis or shadow people experiences or even abductions, this is a very common thing. She insists that 3 gray-colored bipedal aliens took her physically from her 12th floor Manhattan apartment using a blue light stream thing that paralyzed her before lifting her into the air onto a reddish-orange spacecraft, which then veered off toward the Brooklyn Bridge. Once aboard the craft, these beings performed a series of vague, unspecified experiments on her before returning her, unharmed, to her bedroom. She described the aliens as having black eyes. They were able to communicate with her telepathically, a lot of boxes here, telling her in some strange language to be quiet, which is weird because they communicated telepathically, before she found herself unable to move as the blue beam lifted her into the night sky, yada, yada, yada. So after the incident, she claimed that she remembered an examination room where a metallic device was inserted into her nose. The next thing she remembered was waking up back in her apartment next to her husband as if nothing had happened. And her first inclination was that she had dreamed the whole episode. until she discovered a lump in her nose. So the Napolitano went to a doctor, and an x-ray allegedly indicated that she had something lodged in there. Later, an ear, nose, and throat specialist confirmed that a lump of some sort had been inserted there. Essentially, the x-rays confirmed what she had suspected, which was another reason that Hopkins put a lot of credibility into this story. Hopkins claimed that he had uncovered at least 23 witnesses who had come forward to corroborate this narrative, though he never would reveal their names or identities. But then in communication, Hopkins revealed to those supposed police officers that Napolitano was still alive, that she had survived the ordeal. So Richard and Dan reportedly visited her at her apartment, and depending on who you ask, if it's Napolitano, it was an accusatory confrontation. If you ask Hopkins, they claim to him that it was a mutually supportive relationship where they all kind of agreed on what happened that night based on telling each other their personal experiences. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, especially after what comes next, because this is where it gets really dark. According to Hopkins, the, quote, police officer known as Dan began stalking Napolitano. He apparently would stake out her apartment daily. Then, in April 1981, they allegedly kidnapped Napolitano, forcing her into their car and interrogating her for hours about the alleged abduction, trying to see if she knew more than she was letting on or if she was faking it. They even had her take off her shoes and show them her toes to prove that she wasn't an alien herself.
This is one of those weird bits from her tale of how, like, one of them would call her half-breed.
Mm-hmm.
And thought she had webbed toes that would indicate that she was some type of a hybridization.
And this is the problem with coming through the filter of Hopkins, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but he has this whole thing about alien hybrids. This is the Chris Carter playbook. This whole thing is just Chris Carter's narrative for X-Files.
Well, a lot of this is where he got it from.
100%, but I'm saying, like, this plays out like most seasons of X-Files, of the alien abduction stuff. Almost all of this comes from this incident. A lot of the main lore alien abduction stuff comes straight out of this. After this incident where she was kidnapped, Hopkins claimed Dan grew increasingly delusional and obsessed with Napolitano. Supposedly in 1991, in October, he kidnapped her again, on his own this time, and brought her to a beach house on Long Island. This event actually literally happens in the X-Files. And then they retcon it later in those terrible seasons later on, but Napolitano told Hopkins that Dan then ordered her to wear a white nightgown similar to the one she'd worn the night of the abduction, and when she refused to get changed in front of him, he became frantic, attempted to rape her, calling her his, quote, Lady of the Sand. I don't know what the fuck that is.
What?
Yes, this comes from Hopkins. Thankfully, Napolitano somehow was able to escape, and she never saw Dan again. Though she claimed he wrote her letters in which he confessed to being in love with her and to fantasizing about kidnapping her more. Okay, that's not good.
Okay.
During this time, Napolitano also claimed she was being followed by men in black suits, actual men in black this time, causing her to fear for her life. Now, one reading is she's becoming increasingly paranoid for whatever reason, because she saw even these guys as that kind of thing, but now they're just straight up men in black. Also, she could be suffering from some severe PTSD, and on one hand, she could be paranoid because of her fantasy that she's woven, or there's some really serious PTSD going on that's causing her to become paranoid, to have these kind of delusions, or maybe even have a point.
That's what's the best way to get further sympathy if you're trying to, like, spread the story? Paint yourself as even more the victim.
Which she was. She did end up becoming a pretty big public figure for a second. So her case apparently had a really big impact on other witnesses of the event, but a lot of this comes from Dan. Hopkins concluded that Dan and some of the other witnesses didn't come forward and sort of secretly confessed their, I guess, PTSD about the situation afterward. According to the Skeptics UFO newsletter, Dan's mental health specifically deteriorated to the point that he had to be checked into a mental health facility. Okay, good. That's moving forward. As for the supposed foreign dignitary that Richard and Dan had been guarding that night, it supposedly rattled him enough that it changed his political priorities. According to the 2022 documentary Linda Napolitano, The Alien Abduction Case of the Century, this politician wrote a letter to Hopkins emphasizing the importance of taking care of the planet and begging Hopkins to stop investigating the incident so that the extraterrestrials can continue their grand plan.
What? Wait, that's what the supposed letter says?
Yes, that's what Hopkins maintained. Yeah. This is where we're getting into some, really, dude? All right. Napolitano herself suggested that her abduction was meant to draw the attention of world leaders and steer the course of global politics to focus on environmental sustainability.
This is from the beginning of not necessarily abductees, but people that have encountered aliens. A lot of times it's the Space Brother kind of variety where they come and tell you, one of the hallmarks is, impending natural disasters or global catastrophes brought on by human negligence or interference, and that we need to heal the planet physically and psychically and spiritually.
In 1996, Hopkins witnessed the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions. It was not, however, without criticism. The purported evidence put forth in Witnessed in support of Napolitano's claims are contested famously now in the Manhattan Alien Abduction series on Netflix by Hopkins' late ex-wife, Carol Rainey. She died during the production of that series, which I didn't find out about until after I watched it, and so I looked it up. So that's why when they keep showing both of them videos, Napolitano is watching pre-recorded video of her before she died. That's why they never confront each other directly.
Right. But is she not watching video of Linda?
Basically throughout 2022, and then Carol died.
It's too bad.
Yeah, it is really sad. So when they showed Linda that stuff, that was already done. They edited it to make it seem like they're going tit for tat, but the stuff they recorded with Carol was recorded a year or so before.
Okay.
And so the stuff that Carol is reacting to is mostly archival footage and some preliminary stuff that Netflix had done with Linda.
Interesting.
And so it's one of the reasons that Linda sued Netflix immediately after that came out, because she feels like it wasn't a fair representation of the story of her or her ability to argue with Carol. And that lawsuit is ongoing and will go nowhere, by the way.
Yeah, no, I don't think it has any legs to stand on.
She was upset about the way that they framed it for that reason. That it made it seem like, she's like, now I want to be able to rebut her, but I can't because she's dead.
Yeah. I think a lot of things, the strongest evidence isn't what Carol brings forth necessarily.
No, but the interesting thing was that Carol herself was a documentary filmmaker. And a lot of the stuff that they use in that series is actually from her unused footage. Basically, she was going around documenting Budd Hopkins throughout years and was compiling her own documentary. And so a lot of the Netflix stuff uses that. And Linda got upset that she couldn't refute it. Other critics of Hopkins' views on alien abductions in general sort of maintained the normal pushbacks on the phenomenon. But not surprisingly, it's the normal stuff about sleep paralysis and the stuff we've already talked about that everybody kind of knows about already at this point. But to some alien enthusiasts, just the number of witnesses of the event prove that something really did happen that night. And I'm sure something did happen that night. Unfortunately, because of the shadiness of a lot of the people involved, it's hard to tell what it was. But something undoubtedly happened that evening.
It's hard to say. The amount of witnesses lead you to have some type of credibility. The fact that I don't really know what most of the witnesses said, the few that they discuss, they at least refute the police officer, the bodyguards, whatever they are.
Yeah.
And, there's a couple others where, there's an old lady, she doesn't see anything, she didn't know what she saw. She saw a light through closed blinds.
Right.
And there was another one where it's like, there must have been tangible things within the other witness statements, but...
An unfortunate issue with that kind of, if you want to call it journalism or at least investigation, the fact that Hopkins would never identify any of the witnesses doesn't help because even if they did give those statements and even if they were credible, there's no way to corroborate that. So it's always going to like lean into the camp of it's easy to dispute. And that's kind of always a problem with things like whistleblowers or anonymous sources. It's really hard. You just kind of have to take them on their word that these sources, they were telling the truth and that they were sincere. And so that's always going to leave an air of mystery, no matter what, no matter how credible they might have been. But one of the most damning things, I think, honestly, that really hurt Hopkins was that he himself admitted to have never met Dan or Richard. So all of everything he's gotten is either through correspondence in letter form with them or with other people anonymously who knew them, or from Linda Napolitano.
Who might seem to be like the main source of information about them.
Right. That's a big problem because we do have letters from Dan and Richard, but they were not credible on the surface. And one of them pretty credibly suffered from mental illness. So unfortunately, given the lack of concrete evidence, even some of the most hardcore UFO abductee believers think that Linda Napolitano's story is a hoax. Still, despite all of that, Hopkins and Rainey co-wrote the 2003 book Sight Unseen, Science, UFO Invisibility, and Transgenic Beings. In this book, Hopkins, along with Elizabeth Slater, who conducted psychological tests on abductees, likened their experiences, and this focused mostly on the stuff that you touched on in Harvest, sexual experiences, experimentations, assaults, which were portrayed in this book as not unlike rape, but specifically for the purpose of human reproductive capabilities. To the extent where, in the book, Hopkins often seemingly dismisses the subject's conscious memory of abuse for being alien experiences. It's not his most popular book.
Yeah.
He seems to have become more of an alarmist or just more willing to believe like a cycle of cognitive dissonance and self-bias in his approach rather than his earlier stuff where it was more clinical and more skeptical and more objective. And then it gets weird because then he starts seeing these things as a ramping up of some sort of apocalyptic event, and he sees them more and more as menacing and sinister. He describes a lot of the events as nightmarish and severe.
Which I don't think is out of line.
No, but I mean, as the guy goes along, he very obviously has become less and less objective and less skeptical. And I know in his mind, he's like, well, I've got all this evidence and it seems to be building to this thing. That's fine. But you can't go into that thinking that the whole time. Like, you have to...
I mean, I appreciate what he did, like setting up support groups and trying to help people through things, but that is not objective. And you can't keep your objectivity doing that. Once you form these personal relationships with people, you can't separate yourself from their events and the factual natures of those things.
Right. It reminds me a little bit of Michael Moore in that sense. If you watch Roger and Me, it goes through a specific lens. Objectively, he's got a point. Great man on the street stuff. Presents the facts in a way that is hard to dispute. And in a lot of his early work does that. But then when you get later on, he uses the same sort of techniques to make movies that more reinforce the opinions he already has, whether he's right or not. And it kind of goes off the rails to an extent where it's hard to give him credibility as much as he used to have.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's what's happening. So for this last book, just as an example, on May 9th, 2004, Hopkins was interviewed by friend of the pod, Art Bell, on Coast to Coast AM. For those of you out there who don't know, Jake, how would you describe Coast to Coast?
Coast to Coast AM was a nighttime radio broadcast where it started out regionally in the Southwest and expanded out nationwide, where Art Bell would bring different guests on involving the paranormal in a variety of ways. And then people call in with their experiences or whatever paranormal news is going on. It was a playground for those interested in this type of stuff. You're hearing all these different stories. And at the time, that was kind of the main outlet, I would say, for exposure. Pre-podcast, you had this one radio show where this was about aliens and cryptids and UFOs and ancient pyramids and time travel and all of these things that you'd have people who are writing books, promoting books. A lot of conspiracy ideas came from this. And kind of the same way that, say, Alex Jones now is like a purveyor of right-wing insanity and conspiracy conspiracy-laden, QAnon-adjacent BS, Art Bell and later...
That he doesn't believe.
No, he doesn't believe. Art was felt like a radio host who was just happy to give someone a platform. He would push back on certain things, but he wasn't a diehard, dyed-in-the-wool believer. He was a radio host who gave people a platform to express interesting ideas.
Which now is dangerous, but back then was pretty innocent comparatively.
It was a fun radio show to just listen to. You'd hear plenty of wild stories. Some of it would be like hilarious. Some would be really endearing. Some would captivating.
The famous phone call of the guy that escaped from Area 51 or whatever.
I love it. It's on the Tool album, Anima. I think Coast to Coast is still on now. I think with George Knapp.
Well, now it's...
Has George Knapp left?
It's Norrie now.
George Norrie now? Okay.
Yeah, Knapp is gone. But I mean, this is where you get guys like David Icke.
I remember Father Malachi Martin quite a bit.
Oh, boy.
There's the famous Mel's Hole phenomenon that's essentially just coming from people calling and writing in to Coast. That whole story comes from.
Yeah. It was fun. It was innocent, but unfortunately it did lay the groundwork for what we have today, which is not good.
Yes, but just like X-Files doesn't make it a bad thing because it was perverted and manipulated post-mortem.
That is true. So I wanted to share with you a clip from that.
Oh, okay.
I edited down a little clip from, and this comes from his discussion about his last book, 2003.
The whole second half of the book has to deal with people who seem to be creatures, beings, part human and part alien, who seem to be operating in the real world right along with the UFO aliens, the gray beings, in facilitating abductions. In other words, they seem to be able to eat meals, drive cars, talk to people, and so forth, yet they can also, these transgenic beings seem to be able to absolutely control another person's behavior, read their minds, pass through walls, do the things that the aliens themselves are able to do. And this is, of course, the ultimate result of what I had written about in Intruders, where it seemed to be the basic purpose that we discussed earlier of the phenomenon really was to produce this kind of viable mix.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me in terms of the objections science has and how they've had to back away. When I wrote Intruders and I talked about this attempt to create a mix of alien and humans characteristics, I was, of course, attacked roundly. That's impossible. We could never do such a thing. And, of course, since 1987, when that book came out, we have mapped the human genome, which is unbelievable as an accomplishment. And we are now in an area where, as you know, they have been able to take a gene from a jellyfish and splice it into the genetic makeup of a rabbit.
A jelly rabbit.
A jelly rabbit. Finally, a jelly rabbit.
Mummy, when will I get my jelly rabbit?
And then he goes on about these seemingly magical abilities that these hybrid jellyfish rabbits have.
The hybrid infiltration. It's all levels of society.
This is kind of the sad part about Hopkins is that we went from a guy that legitimately brought on scientists, did actual experimentation, real research, and made his bread and butter on credibility. And now he's talking about alien-human hybrids. Like they're a fact of life.
Yes. On the surface, it is almost ridiculously sad that from one point of view, someone has gone from trying to deal with and help people who've had traumatic experiences, try to get through them, understand them, come out the other side, able to live and function.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the further you go down this rabbit hole and the more inundated you are with cases and deeper levels of insidious alien behavior and contact and the furthering plans, you kind of have to up an ante. And whether it's real or not, you keep getting pushed further and further to these edges of believability, plausibility. And also, if you're going to be doing this, what sells? If we go back to the Alex Jones thing, that's why everything this is the most important election of our lifetime. The New World Order has a plan that's going to happen impending. So you gotta buy my boner pills and my brain juice. It's the same reason why certain religions, the Messiah is coming. So you have to act now.
Oh, Jim Baker. Now all he does is sell doomsday prepper shit.
You light the fire. Nothing is more galvanizing and intense than a coming alien invasion. That's going to sell books. That's a enticing and scary proposition. Whether one hand is washing the other, or it's where the evidence, quote unquote, has led him to believe, or this is what's going to sell because this is what's more popular and this is what's going to scare people and make them feel the need to read it before it happens. I mean, I can't say, and it's really your point of view that's going to determine that. But he's certainly not the only person in this field sees a mass hybridization infiltration occurring.
Yeah, but that's its own separate thing because a lot of that gets into eugenics and dysgenics, which is a thing again. The problem that I have is that, David, I think we both now agree that, at least at this point, he's a grifter.
He's been doing it so long, it's really tough to know how much of this is, I believe, and so I'm going to put it out there and make money off of it, or I need to make money, so I'm going to push this out there. Early on, for years and years and years, he was just this crackpot loony who was kind of funny on the outside with this crazy idea, but it gained steam. It's an odd thing to be so devout into that finally breaks through to some type of mainstream. You think if it wasn't working, you would have moved on to some other thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. But the thing about Hopkins was that he already was a successful artist. He was a successful studio artist throughout his entire career. He really wasn't financially dependent on the books that he only wrote, 4 books?
6 books.
But I mean, this wasn't like his entire identity. He had a whole other life that I don't get the grifter vibe from Hopkins. I think he just kind of started believing his own hype a little too much and lost objectivity. And especially since Budd Hopkins died in 2011, long before a lot of these grifters that peddle this stuff found purchase in mainstream American pop culture, or at least pop culture in general. And I don't think at any point I doubted Hopkins' sincerity about his beliefs. I can't say the same thing about David Icke. We both know for a fact Alex Jones is full of shit.
Oh, yeah. 1,000,000%. I think you'd have to be a fool not see that.
I mean, it's literally been proven in court. So I don't feel like he's that kind of guy. But I feel like he was on the path to that, but I think genuinely he thought he was doing good.
I would say that the things he put out, he believed to some extent. That's the way I've read him throughout the years.
I don't think he was bullshitting.
There's a reason that we all know, people that are into the paranormal and the UFO world, they all know Budd Hopkins' name because he was one of those guys who was out there on the front lines in the mass media.
Yep.
Getting these stories out there, getting these ideas out there, getting his name out there as a researcher and both a contactee and abductee helper.
Advocate. He was an advocate, for sure.
Which I think is for good and ill. I think he probably maybe pushed a little bit to get out there and try to sell himself and his ideas rather than focusing on the research or smaller scale tasks to aid in understanding this phenomena. But that's also a reason we know his name.
He will be remembered by a huge swath of the UFO community as the father of the abduction or abductee experience movement, and did do good work. I think his support groups, he really did mean well up until his death. And he believed Linda Napolitano up until the day he died. Now, he and Carol did divorce before he died, and she wholeheartedly believed that Linda was full of shit. And I think lamented, and I think that was one of the reasons for their breakup. But it's not really for us to say. That's just kind of what we've been given in the pop culture. To polish it all off, I just want to leave you all with an excerpt. This is from his foreword from the book Intruders. Quote, "So my request to you, the reader, do not prejudice. Realize if any aspect of the UFO phenomenon as reported is true, then any of the rest of the reported phenomenon may be true too. Try not to put anthropomorphic limits on what may be an entirely alien intelligence and technology. The true skeptic cannot, at the beginning, accept the impossibility of anything."
Well said.
Very well said. And that's George Hopkins. Not George. Budd Hopkins. Jesus Christ. Oh, God, I hope there's no George.
Guy?
Talk about a hybrid. No. Don't need that.
George.
He was there at the Philadelphia experiment. No.
I just typed in, who is George Hopkins?
Bob Lazar's roommate in college. It's not for us to parse. Our opinions on it honestly don't really matter. Budd Hopkins believed it.
And in the stars is where you will find us.
We don't use Starlink, though.
No, we do not.
And
We
we
tried
will
to
not.
overturn the election that way. It wasn't working out. Thank you for listening to us, checking out our podcast. We've done some paranormal stuff and some UFO stuff, but I think we're going to have a few more UFO things and alien stuff in the pipeline and a little alien UAP wap series that we're doing.
Those are very different things, I'd like to point out.
Let's squish them all together. So please do stop back and check those out. Before you do that, if you wouldn't mind sharing, subscribing. If you think there are other people might be interested in hearing what we're talking about, send it their way. If you do know an alien, please drop them a line. Let them know we have a podcast out. Let them tell their friends in Zeta Reticuli, because that's an untapped market, friends. We need that.
It really is.
It's
going to take a few years to get to Alpha Centauri, but
If you can get them to give their podcast app of the choice 5 DB Coopers, just because Zeta Reticuli, they love the DB Cooper story.
that was apropos of nothing. They just like DB Cooper. It's nothing to do with aliens.
It's like the French loving Jerry Lewis. I don't know.
Nobody
That's just
knows
what they're into.
The Germans love David Hasselhoff. I don't know. Nobody knows why.
There's no accounting for taste here or the rest of the galaxy.
It's probably ironic, but we don't quite get it either. So,
you play to the fan base. Come back. We thank you for listening. We are going to shut this down. But before we do, Skip, what should they do?
well, they should probably, those who are still listening for some reason, pay their tabs, tip their wait staff, make sure they've cleaned up after themselves to some sort of reasonable degree, make sure they have did all that, make sure they have done their, I get out of rhythm and then I forget where the fuck I am.
Hey, let's come back to us, Frank, real quick.
Let's come back to me real quick. Charlie Scheider, 19er, let's come back to me. This is
Is
Pigpen.
that Charlie Chiter?
Yeah, it's Roy Scheider's ham radio handle. I don't know.
What?
It's Chris Christopherson in Convoy. I don't fucking know. What's your 10-4?
This is Red Rider. Let's come back to me.
Hammer down.
We got some bears up ahead of us. Let's come back. Help us end this pod.
This is a level of hell that we have never...
I'm going to need an old priest and a young priest.
They walk into a bar, you see. Please make sure you support your local comic shops and retailers. And from Dispatch Ajax, we would like to say, Godspeed, fair wizards!
Let's come back to us.
Call the ball.
Please, go away.